Histories in Review. I am your host, Captain Tim Rutlidge, and this is my cabin on the ship Saturn. Since this month marks 150 years since the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, it only makes sense to closely examine the infamous event, who was involved in it, and what happened in the aftermath.
It was the evening of 14th April, 1865. While attending the performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth and died the next day, only 5 days after the end of the long American Civil War.
Mind you, Abraham Lincoln was not the first president to have an assassination attempt. In 1835, Richard Lawrence tried to assassinate Andrew Jackson, but he failed due to moist weather causing his pistols to misfire.
As mentioned before, the ringleader to Lincoln's assassination was Southern sympathizer and stage performer John Wilkes Booth, who came from a whole family of performers.
At the time of the assassination, John Wilkes Booth was a well-known actor, skilled in Shakespearean roles. One could hypothetically compare his assassination of Lincoln to Kenneth Branagh killing President Clinton, or even George Clooney killing President Obama.
Booth attended Lincoln's second inauguration on March 4th. Afterwards, Booth commented in his diary he had a good chance of killing Lincoln that day. On April 11th, Booth attended a speech at the White House where Lincoln supported the enfranchisement of former slaves. That was enough for Booth to decide on assassination.
For the past 3 nights before attending Ford's Theater, Lincoln had been having dreams of himself being assassinated. Lincoln's bodyguard, William Crook, advised Lincoln not to go to Ford's Theater, but Lincoln had already promised his wife they would be going. What was even more odd, Lincoln's parting words were "Goodbye, Crook," rather than the usual "Good-night, Crook."
Meanwhile, Booth gathered together a gang of co-conspirators in the plot against Lincoln. These included Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, David Harold, Michael O'Laughlin, John Surratt, and Samuel Arnold. On Good Friday, April 14th, it was time for Booth and company to get the job done.
Originally, Booth intended to stab General Grant after shooting President Lincoln, but the information he had gathered on the evening was contrary. Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Lincoln were on very bad terms, so Major Henry Rathbun and Clara Harris accepted the invitation to Ford's Theater. An attempt by Michael O'Laughlin was made to kill Grant, but it was entirely unsuccessful.
Upon arrival at Ford's Theater, Lincoln and his wife Mary sat in the presidential box alongside Rathbun and Clara Harris. The orchestra played "Hail to the Chief," and the play continued. Mrs. Lincoln remarked upon what Miss Harris would think of her hanging on to her husband, and Lincoln replied, "She won't think anything about it." Those were his last words.
The key moment when Booth shot Lincoln was during what was considered one of the funniest lines of the play, where laughter would be loud enough to muffle the sounds of a gunshot.
Lincoln's hired bodyguard went off with the presidential footman for a drink at a nearby tavern, leaving the president unguarded. Booth, carrying a Philadelphia Derringer pistol, was able to gain access to the presidential box. And, as the audience laughed at the hijinks on stage, Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back of the head, and the cries of Mrs. Lincoln echoed through the theater.
What Booth shouted after jumping from the box is still a subject of discussion. The most widely believed phrase was "Sic semper tyrannis," while others claim it was "The South is avenged," "The South shall be free," or even "I have done it."
Army Surgeon Charles Leal quickly made his way to the presidential box and did his best to save President Lincoln. Henry Rathbun, meanwhile, was stabbed by Booth and was seriously wounded.
Since Lincoln wouldn't survive the journey back to the White House, a makeshift hospital was set up in the nearby Peterson House. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton effectively ran the U.S. government for several hours, issuing the orders to pursue Booth and his accomplices.
Charles Leal, along with Doctors Charles Taft and Albert King, relocated to the Peterson House, and a lengthy surgery was performed with Army Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes, Charles Crane, Anderson Abbott, and Robert Stone. Despite their best efforts, Lincoln succumbed to his wounds and passed away at 7:22 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, at the age of 56. In the meantime, Booth and his cronies were still at large.
At the same time of Lincoln's assassination, Lewis Powell and George Atzerodt were in charge of attacking William Seward and Andrew Johnson, respectively, thus breaking the continuity of the U.S. government. Thankfully, both attempts were unsuccessful.
Seward, who broke his jaw and right arm after falling from a carriage, was stuck in bed with a jaw splint. Upon Powell's arrival, Seward's son Frederick tried to fend off the potential assassin, and after some unsuccessful lunges at Seward, Powell rode away from the house on his horse. After becoming lost in the streets of Washington, he made his way to the Surratt boarding house, where he was arrested on 17th April. Atzerodt, meanwhile, became intoxicated at the tavern where Johnson was staying, lost heart, and checked into the Pennsylvania House Hotel for a good night's rest. He was arrested at the house of his cousin on April 20th.
Late that evening, Booth and David Harold escaped Washington, D.C. and made their way to Surrattsville, Maryland, eventually hiding at the farm of tobacco farmer Richard H. Garrett. They remained at the farm until April 26, when soldiers of the 16th New York Cavalry arrived and surrounded the barn where Booth and Harold were hiding.
Harold immediately surrendered to the cavalry, but Booth stayed in the barn. The soldiers set the barn on fire, and as Booth tried to escape the blazing barn, Sergeant Boston Corbett shot him in the back of the neck, piercing 3 vertebrae and severing the spinal cord. 3 hours later, John Wilkes Booth was dead.
Before the end of the month, Booth's accomplices were arrested, and Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt were hanged in July 1865. John Surratt escaped to Canada and then Liverpool, ultimately being caught in Egypt in November 1866. Since the jury couldn't agree on a verdict, Surratt was released as a free man.
On 21st April, Lincoln's funeral train departed Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. Every town lined up by the tracks in mournful vigil to greet the train. Mary Lincoln never recovered the loss of her husband, and after the death of her youngest son, Tad, became mentally unstable. Robert Lincoln sent her to a mental institution, and she died at the house of her sister in 1882. Major Rathbun suffered much the same as Mary Lincoln. After his marriage to Clara Harris in 1867 and the birth of their 3 children, the Rathbuns moved to Germany when Henry was made U.S. Consul to Hanover. In 1883, Rathbun stabbed and shot his wife to death, then stabbed himself in the chest. Surviving, Rathbun spent the rest of his life in the Asylum for the Insane in Hildesheim, where he died in 1911. William Seward continued to serve as Secretary of State under Andrew Johnson and purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, and was later dubbed Seward's Folly. In 1869, Seward retired from politics and passed away in 1872. Andrew Johnson succeeded Lincoln as president and started the Reconstruction in the South. He went on trial for impeachment in 1868, which severely destroyed his image. In 1875, Johnson was elected to the U.S. Senate, but died 6 months later. The last surviving witness to Lincoln's assassination, Samuel James Seymour, passed away in his Maryland home in 1956. Immediately after Lincoln's assassination, the great poet Walt Whitman composed a poem regarding the end of the Civil War and the death of America's greatest leader. "O Captain, my Captain."
If you want to know more about the assassination of President Lincoln, I highly recommend you read Bill O'Reilly's book Killing Lincoln. It's a slightly long read, but it does give a good idea of the who, what, when, and where of the whole assassination attempt. For Histories in Review, I'm Captain Tim Rutlidge. Good day.